Okay, so just one more thing before I move on, or two more things before I move on to antagonism with regard to situation. Now, one of the things that Performa has done well in developing an audience that is specific to these kinds of practices and therefore familiar with and quote unquote ready for these works. Helguera says the key quote the key to a successful project lies in understanding the social context in which it will take place and how it will be negotiated with the participants or audience in question. So, in other words, that's my dog scratching. Um, in other words, uh, you have know thy audience and know thy arena. Really important things to think about. And he goes off and talks a little bit about the relationship between social work and social practice or the socially engaged art. And I think most interestingly with this, he says both social work and art practice are based on the postmodern perspective that it is the perception of facts, not the facts themselves, that matter. With that, I want to move into antagonism and the work of Thomas Hirschhorn. All right, so this year, Thomas Hirschhorn, who is a European born conceptual artist who is the favorite of quite a few authors on relational aesthetics or relational antagonism, as Claire Bishop deals with um, in a very important essay. So Thomas Hirschhorn went up to the Bronx into a housing project called Forest Houses and built this structure, and it's called the Gramsci Monument. And he's referencing the Italian Marxist who well, he's just referencing his work, and that Italian Marxist Gramsci uh, dealt a lot with hegemony and how which relates a lot to positionality, and Hirschhorn's work always relates to positionality. All of these topics generally have a very deep correlation. Um, so, what Gramsci posited was that counter hegemonies needed to be established in order to break down the hegemony. And so, the hegemony is the power structure that I talked about last week with regard to who has the ability to speak. It's those hegemonic structures that dictate who has the ability to speak. And the only way to break down a hegemony is not from the inside, or not to like fight the Leviathan, as it were, but to develop counter hegemonies or counter structures in the same way that the feminists develop their own history that can be seen as a counter hegemony, one that is exclusive and also inclusive to a specific community. So, by building a monument in the Bronx, we have a very highbrow artist who's represented by a fantastic gallery. This project was funded by one of the leading art funding agencies in the country, DIA. They're the people who are behind Donald Judd's Marfa uh, occupation, for lack of a better term. Um, and so he comes into this community and builds this structure. And on some level, people have read it as an attempt to establish a counter hegemony, one that is in the voice of the people in this community. And so, what he did is he went to this community and he hired people from the housing projects to help build this monument. And so, he turns the idea of a monument on its head. He turns the idea of social practice on its head. And in a lot of ways, this work embodies the sense of antagonism with regard to performative practices. What some of you might notice is that this work, being part of an art world structure, being on a map but of one of the premier arts establishments, DIA, it's not really that antagonistic. This is not a protest, and a lot of these practices need to be teased out of activist works and looked at for aesthetic purposes because it's trying to relate itself to the discourse on art. Hirschhorn thinks about other sculptors. He thinks about other artists. He thinks about how art can change the world, but he's not gunning to change the world. He's gunning to start conversations about the possibility of changing the world. And so, it's important to understand that these projects are not necessarily supposed to rewrite history. What they're meant to do, and Helguera gives a fantastic example of his May 2003 project, which he details on page 62 to page 64, where it's more about eliciting a conversation and less about affecting actual change. Change might happen, sure, but a conversation is going to be the start of any possible change. Now, this is not new territory for us. Our conversation about Wachenklasse and their barge symposiums. We've talked about various different avenues that artists have put themselves in the public arena to affect change, to have conversations. At this point in 2013, all of that stuff is understood. We get the idea that art can actually change the way we think about the world. But we also understand that it's an art world structure. And so while people might look with suspicion on Hirshhorn's Gramsci monument outwardly, when you get inside of it, and here is the website. Let me move this little screen a little bit. Boop, boop, boop. When you get inside of what's happening here, it's very nuanced, it's very labored, and it's all geared towards starting a conversation. That's the biggest thing. So, program, here's the schedule of events, da 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 da. Obviously, here we can see that it ended. The location, the maps, the residents, and he gives us all of these facts about this project so that we understand who we're dealing with. We understand what the audience is. And so basically what happened is this thing was established, programmed events occurred there, but you had all these people that took the train up to the northern tip of New York City into the Bronx and began looking at this community. And so in as much as it was a monument for the community, it was also a monument for people to investigate the sense of community in this place. Here's this like really random fact. Part of me, I view these projects with a lot of suspicion. Here you have an artist, Thomas Hirshhorn, who's made a considerable amount of money on the production of this, and will continue to make money on this project through the sale of books and other reproductions. He is pretty good when it comes to paying back the community. He paid the workers to build this thing. He contracted community workers and didn't bring in his own workers. So in a lot of ways, you can view this as like, oh, this is art doing the right thing. But at the same time, it's also not really art doing. I don't know. That's a conversation that's up to you, but I wanted to just introduce this project to you. Now, really quickly, we're going to switch gears and then talk about the idea of, let me move this thing back, boop, boop, boop. See how easy Screencast-O-Matic is, everybody? And we're going to talk about the idea of performance. So, yes, we have a very short chapter in this text on the idea of performance, but that very short chapter is very informative. And so what I'm showing you here, this is two images of Sarah Mickelson's Devotion Study Number 1, American Dancer, from the Whitney Biennial last year. That should say 2012, not 2013. Let's change that real quick. Screencast-O-Matic, it's crazy. Oops. So the reason I'm showing you this is because during this biennial, and all of you understand what the Whitney Biennial is, they actually dedicated an entire floor to durational projects, most specifically performance works. This marked the first time in the biennial's history that performance had taken a main stage. It was put on the same pedestal as the other art practices, painting, sculpture, video, all that stuff. And this was really a watershed moment for performance. 2012 was a big, well, Marina Abramović had the close of her project, or the artist is present was a few years prior to this. And there were lots of conversations about the nature of performance art, about the legacy of performance art, and about the position of performance with regard to other artistic practices. And so the curators behind the 2012 biennial took that to heart. And so they developed a platform where these kinds of events can happen. And so here you have one performance that exists, and here is so this is what happens on the fourth floor. This is the schedule of the Whitney Biennial. During most artist residencies, the fourth floor will be open and active to visitors during museum hours. And then here is, this is Mickelson's project. Here are other performances. Some film screenings also happened on the fourth floor, other performances. And so you get the point. This was a platform for this kind of artistic practice, which is really important. And I mean, this is why it gets a book or a chapter in Pablo Helguera's manual. If you're making socially engaged art, you have to understand that it involves ideas of the performance or the performative. Just really quickly, I want to show you also something that happened at the biennial. This is a very interesting artist named Kate Hardy, and you can see her name down on the bottom. She is using the platform that the biennial put forth, this room, to engage a conversation about the nature of fashion, the politics of body imagery, and how people engage with that, and how, what is a fashion show, what is a performance art show, how are those two things different, where do they overlap. And so here are a few images from the New York Times Style magazine of Kate Hardy's installation here, the performance, excuse me. You know, models, knowing your participants. This is Miss Hardy here. She is often seen with half of her hair dyed one color, half dyed the other color, although currently her hair is all blonde. And you can see, I mean, all of these things look as though they could fit very easily into the realm of high fashion. And that's the point. That's what Hardy's project was engaging with, was this conversation between these two spaces. And what Helguera deals with in his conversation on performance is its relationship to pedagogy, and how if you bring in the instructor, or you bring in somebody who by proxy becomes an instructor because they're introducing ideas that are relative to the critique, you automatically have performance. That's when that is where it's distanced from, or you automatically have a socially engaged project. Excuse me, not performance. And here you can see that Kate Hardy is, to a very lesser degree, engaging with this. I mean, the kinds of projects that Helguera talks about are much more dialogical, in the sense that Grant Kester frames the term, where you have you do have people in much more of an educational structure. Here, within the biennial format, it's very similar to the performa format, where you have people who know about art history, they know about performance art, and they are coming to get kind of a reified critique of it. So, and this concludes video 2. Video 2.